Peace, everybody. I have a new video I'm finna do right now, dealing with common knowledge and how fallacious it is to associate contemporary common information and realities, to associate them with ancient realities, because common knowledge adjusts over time, and people seem to forget what was common 100 years ago is no longer common. What was common 1,000 years ago is not common today. Prime example, it was common for people to ride horses as a main means of transportation, horses and chariots. Now people drive cars and take trains, So that's an easy example to show you how just because you see something going on today doesn't necessarily mean that what was going on 100 years ago or 150 years ago. And I try to actually create these videos to convey the ideas that I think in my mind, because the ideas start with the heart, and then it's translated in the mind, and then it's articulated with the lips, the tongue, the physical body. So you want to bring that thought and try to actually preserve as much of it as possible, and hopefully the people that is listening can understand exactly the true and full meaning as far as what I'm trying to say, because these are thoughts that I'm trying to bring out. So I was thinking about how today in the United States, and also Africa, really all over the world, it's common to call black people lazy, because for the past 40 years, particularly in America, because you got Africans and Caribbeans and whatnot calling black people in America lazy, because for the last 40, 50 years, the politicians displaced black people and caused an artificial lack of employment. So you got a lot of people that's unemployed and doesn't have access to the industries like we used to. So it's common to look and see a black man on the corner with a 40 ounce in his hand, drinking, or with a cup in his hand, begging, because this was systematic design engineering. So people are looking at that and saying that the black people was lazy. They don't realize that in the 1800s, it was common for black people to be an entire industry. Like literally, we were the industry. There was no illegal immigrants over here. It were illegal immigrants, which were the Caucasian Europeans, but as far as the illegal immigrants that we see with all of the jobs, with all of the so-called minority benefits and business loans, they weren't here. So it wasn't common to call black people lazy in the 1800s, because we represented entire industries, and plus we fought all of the wars, and we built the cities, and also we was writing books, and with the 1800s, black people were the industry. 1700s, black people were the people who actually navigated the world and designed cities and founded cities and led expeditions. In particular, allegedly, a black Frenchman, De Sabo, came to Chicago. He's the founder of Chicago, but whatever. The Potawatomi was here, but this was common to hear that black people was founding cities and establishing whole governments in the 1700s. 1800s, not so. You stop hearing about black people, so-called Negroes, founding cities and architect and designing cities. So because it's less common, people just forget. People forget that it ever happened, and it is erased outside of their memory. See, in America, in the United States, we have something called positive law. The United States Code is positive law, and the Constitution is based on positive law. Well, positive law means everything is moving forward. Everything is amended. And once it's amended, the previous situation is forgotten as though it never happened. It's like after the war, 1812, the United States made a deal with Britain, which said, okay, we're going to go back to the original borders before the war happened. And it's as though the war never happened. They just said the war never happened, because in the war 1812, the Native Americans actually won. They defeated the United States. That's why it took another 30, 40 years before the United States could actually get Chicago, because the war started in Chicago, but the Potawatomi was financed and supported by the British. And during the war 1812, they burnt down the White House. And they also liberated a lot of black people and sent them to Britain to be free. People don't talk about that because they say it never happened because of positive law. Things are only forward moving, And the same thing is with the culture. We forget about each generation as though it never happened. We see TV shows, the Me Too. We got Me TV. But it's like it never happened. Originally, the black people in America was the so-called minority, oppressed people now. Now, everybody under the sun want to be a minority. They want to get minority so-called benefits. They want to get affirmative action. So it's almost as though our struggle never happened. We was totally replaced. Like, it's similar to in a computer program, you got a hard drive in a computer system, I should say. Now, if you actually name a file the same exact name and drag it into the same exact folder, that file will replace the original, and you will never be able to retrieve the original. It don't matter how much data is in the file. As long as it got the same exact name, it will replace it. And I know for personal experience, I lost a lot of data that way. Dragging a file into the wrong folder with the same name, you delete everything. But they tell you, okay, do you want to do this? You mistakenly say yeah, and everything's gone. But that's the same way with the culture and with the common knowledge. Now, it was common knowledge in the 1800s for alleged black men to be the greatest authors of all time. In particular, we have another black Frenchman by the name of Alexander Dumas, right? He wrote the Three Musketeers. He wrote the Count of Monte Cristo. He wrote the Man with the Iron Mask 20 years later. Him and his son wrote these books, right? But in the Three Musketeers, he wrote, this common knowledge. It was the time period dealt with the 1600s with King Louis the 13th, I think it was the 13th. Now, he said this, right? The Three Musketeers had Caucasian slaves, servants, manservants. It was written in the book. They all had these white servants, right? They called them Picards, and they was walking around, they was lords. You see what I'm saying? And also, in particular, I'm gonna say that how common knowledge changed. Now, in the book, the villain in the book was this lady named Lady D. Winters and Cardinal Rochelle. You see what I'm saying? Cardinal, he was the one that actually ran the country from the Catholic Church. And the King Louis, he was like under the Catholic Church for some reason. They must have got defeated, but the Cardinal had more power than the King. And the Cardinal had his royal guards. No, he had his guards. They had two different types of soldiers. The King had Musketeers, and the Cardinals had guards, and they fought each other. But this is not what I'm trying to say. So this lady, Lady D. Winters, right, and the Three Musketeers, she was from England. She went back and forth between England and France. They was right next to each other, and she was married to a baron in England, who she ended up, found. He died. I ain't gonna tell you what happened because you might want to read it. But the thing I'm trying to say is this, right? She had a Negro boy with her. It's a scene that was in the church, and they saw her in this chariot, this fancy chariot, and she had a Negro boy, right? They didn't say if this was her son, that was the son of her and the Lord from England, but she just had this Negro boy. And one of what's his name? It was Pathos. Aaron. It was Pathos. He was messing with these old rich white women. Well, they ain't say what they were, but yeah. And he was in the church too. And one of the white women say, one of the old rich ladies, I don't know what their color was, I don't know, because they didn't really specify. You just assume they were so-called white. But she say, because that lady is with that Negro boy, she must be a princess. So back then, being a black person was associated with being royal. And this is in the book Three Musketeers. And this book, Three Musketeers, is seen as one of the greatest books ever written. And it was written by a so-called Negro in the 1800s, the early 1800s. Now, it was common for the so-called Negro to be the greatest writers, authors of all time. But now people saying, okay, we not the greatest authors of all time, but historically we were. It's just that people forgot because over time the so-called greatest authors have been replaced, who's seen as the greatest authors, and the so-called Negro authors are not getting the same type of representation or exposure that they did in the 1800s. Now, what you will ask yourself, how was it that so-called Negro authors, black authors, had worldwide exposure in the 1800s and not today when it comes to literature and education and engineering? Because another example, it was common in the 1800s for the so-called black man in America to be an engineer, architect, Granville T. Woods. And it was also common for the Caucasian to try to steal the ideas and the patents from the so-called Negro. And this is why, Westinghouse and them, they were so used to stealing patents from the so-called Negro. They kind of did it with Tesla, but they didn't do it with Tesla because they actually made a deal with Tesla that he ended up voluntarily, disregarding. But they were so used to just stealing when they did the alternator. And they actually, did when they powered whole cities with the alternator, basically, and made energy off of hydroelectricity. But Granville T. Woods had over 30 patents. One of the patents was the telephone. He actually sent the articulate voice over a telegraph, which Graham Bell ended up stole it from him. And then a lot of his patents he ended up selling. But one of his patents, he was able to send wireless communication between trains. Like Granville T. Woods' major field of expertise were the locomotive industry in the mid 1800s. Now, this was common knowledge to have black engineers and inventors in the 1800s up until the early 1900s. Now, that's totally forgotten because we have been displaced from these industries, and we have been displaced from people's worldview. The media, they don't really promote. Like right now, the modern cell phone, the whole infrastructure was developed by Jesse Russell, a black guy who's still alive right now. 4G towers, 5G towers, all of that was developed by this black guy, Jesse Russell. You can look him up right now. But the fact that it's not common knowledge, people forget, and they associate what they see right now. They see a bunch of illegal immigrants, 20 of them working in a McDonald's, or 20 of them working on a street, or 30 of them working on a house. They're going to say that's hard work. They're going to think this is how it always been, because they don't see, like, their eyes don't see the black man involved in these industries, because we will shut out these industries. And in particular, we will shut out these industries by blacks, politicians working with the Caucasians. You have Harold Washington, the mayor of Chicago in the 1980s. He made Chicago a sanctuary city and empowered the Mexican community and the illegal immigrant community so they could not get, I don't want to say evicted, but deported from Chicago. This has strengthened their whole entire 40-year history since. 40 years since, 35 years since Harold Washington did that. They are doing better in Chicago than the black people. Harold Washington didn't lay down nothing for blacks, the future of blacks. He did that for the illegals. Barack Obama, he gave DACA children, he gave them work vouchers. He looked out for their future. They didn't do that for the black man. The only person who actually tried to help the so-called black man get into business and get jobs was Donald Trump. But specifically, intentionally, the Negroes have betrayed us. They have been working in cahoots and in collaboration, especially the black women talking about, particularly the black women talking about divest movement. Like, why are they trying to destroy the black community by saying a black man ain't nothing? Because they have failed for the propaganda, or they're creating the propaganda and perpetuating, because they should know the history that over 80-90% of the useful inventions in the world were developed by black people, black men in particular. You wouldn't have heart transplants, blood plasma, none of that. paints. You would have none of that. But now all of a sudden we're not worthy enough to even exist, and you're going to divest and abandon the black men. Like, okay. But I'm saying this, what's common knowledge is deception, because we only associate common knowledge with contemporary time. We see people living in a house now. That don't necessarily mean they built the house. That don't mean they didn't go in there and kill the people that had the house. That don't mean none of that. All that means is they just live in there now. You can't associate them living in that house now with 100 years ago, because 100 years ago was a whole different reality that we can't even understand, because you don't try to understand. But that's the purpose of this video. You know, I want to talk about the fallacy of common knowledge, and how common knowledge is deception, and it could be used to erase history and perpetuate fallacies and falsehoods and justify. It could be used to justify oppression, or justify a person's position because of what they see now. You don't want to think about what happened prior. You know, it's like the Jews, the so-called Jews. Even though on average the so-called Jews are doing well economically, but they always want to remind you of what happened to them in the so-called Holocaust. And also they even want to talk about what happened in ancient Egypt. Talk about they were slaves in Egypt. They always want to get this pity, because they understand that by them keep constantly reminding you about what happened to them allegedly thousands of years ago, you're going to associate that with them today. And the same tactic could be used with the so-called Negro. If black people that's constantly reminded each other of what always happened in different time periods, similar to what Tariq Nasheed does. He does that, but it should be more people that partake in that. It shouldn't just be one guy taking it upon himself to enlighten the entire world about the black people's history, because there's only so much time that he has to do it, you know. And when you only have a certain amount of time, limited amount of time, it's going to be certain things that's left out. That's about it, though.